In the early months of 1942, the Pacific Ocean was not a contested battleground. It was a Japanese lake. While the world focused on the German U-boat wolf packs terrorizing the Atlantic, a far more terrifying predator was stalking the warm waters of the Pacific. These were the I-boats, the underwater giants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. To understand the terror they inspired, you have to understand the scale. A standard German U-boat displaced about 700 tons. The Japanese I-class submarines were Leviathans, displacing over 2,500 tons. They were double the size of their American counterparts. They were not just submarines, they were submersible cruisers. Some carried reconnaissance float planes folded inside watertight hangars on their decks. They had ranges of over 14,000 miles, capable of sailing from Tokyo to the west coast of the United States, attacking and returning without refueling. But it wasn't just their size that made them deadly. It was what they carried in their tubes. American submarine commanders in 1942 were cursing their own torpedoes, which often bounced off Japanese hulls without exploding. Meanwhile, the Japanese possessed the Longlands, the Type 93 and Type 95 torpedoes. These were, without question, the most advanced underwater weapons on Earth. Fueled by pure oxygen, they left no bubble wake on the surface. They were invisible killers that could travel 3 times farther than American torpedoes and carried a warhead massive enough to snap a destroyer's keel in half. The apex of this dominance occurred on the 15th of September 1942. The location was the waters south of the Solomon Islands. Commander Takakazu Kinashi, captain of the submarine I-19*, raised his periscope and saw the prize every submarine commander dreamed of: the American aircraft carrier USS Times Wasp*. The ocean was calm. The American destroyers, relying on primitive sonar that struggled in the warm thermal layers of the Pacific, were deaf to the monster lurking beneath them. Kinashi remained cool. He maneuvered his massive vessel into position. He didn't just fire 1 torpedo, he unleashed a spread of 6. What followed was the single most devastating torpedo salvo in the history of naval warfare. 3 torpedoes slammed into the USS Times, Wasp*. The explosions were apocalyptic, igniting aviation fuel and instantly turning the carrier into a floating inferno. But the Longlances weren't finished. The remaining torpedoes raced past the burning carrier and continued for miles. One struck the destroyer USS Times O'Brien*, eventually breaking her in 2. Another hit the battleship USS Times, North Carolina*, tearing a massive hole in her hull. In less than 2 minutes, a single Japanese submarine had crippled an entire US carrier task force. Inside the Times I-19*, the crew listened to the distant, crushing sounds of breaking steel and secondary explosions. There was no panic, only the disciplined silence of the samurai. In these early days, the Japanese crews felt invincible. They believed the deep ocean was their sanctuary. They believed the Americans were blind and deaf beneath the waves. As Times I-19 slipped away into the dark blue depths, unmolested and undetected, the crew believed that the Pacific would belong to them forever. They had no idea that the Americans were already working on a technology that would strip away their cloak of invisibility. They didn't know that the ocean was about to become transparent. But for now, in 1942, the Phantom Fleet ruled the depths, and the terrifying silence of the sea belonged to Japan. In 1943, the war in the Pacific shifted from the open ocean to the laboratory. While the Japanese Navy relied on the bravery of their samurai spirit and the raw power of their massive Longlands torpedoes, the United States Navy turned to a group of physicists at Harvard University. Their mission was to solve a problem that had plagued naval warfare for decades. How do you kill a submarine that you cannot see? For the first 2 years of the war, attacking a submerged submarine was a guessing game. A destroyer would rush over the last known position, dump barrels of explosives, depth charges off the back, and hope for the best. If the Japanese captain turned left or right or dove deeper, the explosives detonated harmlessly in empty water. The ocean was simply too big, and the depth charges were too dumb. The scientists at the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory realized that making a bigger explosion wasn't the answer. The answer was intelligence. They needed a weapon that could think. The result was one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II, the Mark 24 mine. The name itself was a lie. It wasn't a mine at all. It was the world's first acoustic homing torpedo. The development team nicknamed it Fido because, like a loyal dog, it would sniff out its target and refuse to let go. To the naked eye, Fido was unimpressive. It was short, squat, and seemingly underpowered. It moved at a sluggish 12 knots, slower than most ships. But Fido didn't need speed. It needed silence. It was electric, leaving no wake of bubbles. Embedded in its nose were 4 piezoelectric hydrophones, electronic ears that listened to the frequency of underwater sound. The logic of the weapon was terrifyingly simple. It turned the enemy's greatest strength into their fatal weakness. When a Japanese submarine captain realized he was under attack, his training dictated a standard maneuver: dive deep and run fast. But to run fast, the submarine had to spin its propellers at maximum RPM. This created cavitation, thousands of tiny bubbles collapsing against the bronze blades, creating a distinct, rhythmic hissing noise. To the Fido torpedo, that noise was a beacon. The weapon featured a rudimentary onboard computer made of vacuum tubes. If the sound was louder on the left, the rudder turned left. If the sound was louder on the right, it turned right. It would spiral downward in a relentless, predatory dance, adjusting its course every second, homing in on the desperate churning of the Japanese propellers. But Fido was only the executioner. It needed a spotter. This led to the second half of the miracle, the Sonobuoy. Before 1943, an aircraft flying over the ocean was deaf. It could see a submarine on the surface, but the moment the sub dove, the pilot was blind. The Sonobuoy changed the laws of physics. It was a floating radio transmitter dropped from a plane. Upon hitting the water, it deployed a hydrophone on a long wire, dangling it deep into the thermal layers of the ocean. Suddenly, the pilot in the sky could hear times what was happening hundreds of feet below the surface. He could hear the pumps, the engines, and the screws of the Japanese submarine. The combination was lethal. An Avenger torpedo bomber would drop a pattern of sonobuoys to trap the sub in a net of sound. Once the target was pinpointed, they didn't drop a depth charge. They dropped Fido. The Japanese crews had no idea this technology existed. They would hear a splash, followed by silence. No ping of active sonar. No roar of destroyer engines. Just a quiet, electric whirring closing in from the dark. They would accelerate to escape, never realizing that the faster they ran, the louder they screamed to the electronic ears of the torpedo chasing them. The age of the blind depth charge was over. The age of the smart weapon had begun. It began as a ghost story among the radio operators of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By late 1943, submarine crews returning to Kure and Yokosuka began to report a disturbing phenomenon. They were used to the terrifying, rhythmic ping of American active sonar, a sound that hammered against the hull like a physical blow, announcing that a destroyer had found them. They respected the ping. It was a clear declaration of war. But this new threat was different. It was silent. Or rather, it was a noise that made no sense. Deep in the Philippine Sea, inside the sweating, humid hull of a submerged I-class submarine, the radio operator would sit hunched over his equipment. Suddenly, his headphones would fill with a strange, high-pitched electronic chatter. It wasn't voice communications. It wasn't the Morse code of the fleet. It was a bizarre, rhythmic, chirping, or whining sound that seemed to be coming from the water itself. The captains were baffled. They would raise the periscope and scan the horizon. Nothing. No destroyers. No cruisers. Just the empty, rolling waves of the Pacific. "The ocean is empty," they would say. "We are safe." They were dead wrong. What the Japanese operators were intercepting was the radio carrier wave of the American Sonobuoy. High above the clouds, an American TBF Avenger torpedo bomber was circling like a hawk. The pilot had dropped a series of small, floating canisters into the water. Upon impact, these canisters deployed a hydrophone on a long wire that dangled 60 feet beneath the surface. These were the floating ears. They were picking up the faint, mechanical hum of the Japanese submarines' engines and transmitting that sound instantly via radio waves up to the circling aircraft. The strange chirping the Japanese heard was the sound of their own death being broadcast to the sky. The tragedy for the Japanese crews was that their training had not prepared them for passive warfare. They were taught that if there was no ping, they were invisible. So, when they heard the splash of the buoys hitting the water, they often misinterpreted it. Some captains thought the Americans were dropping depth charges that were failing to explode. Others thought it was floating debris. In a fatal miscalculation, many commanders would order their submarines to speed up to clear the area. They didn't realize that by increasing their speed, they were simply turning up the volume for the listeners above. The moment of realization usually came too late. The crew of the submarine would be running at 15 knots, confident they had slipped away into the deep dark. The radio operator would still be puzzling over the strange interference in his headset. Then, the hydrophones would pick up a new sound. A splash, then a buzzing electric whir. It wasn't the heavy, thumping screw of a destroyer. It was something small, something fast. The Mark 24 Fido torpedo had entered the water. Guided by the data from the Sonobuoys, the pilot had placed the weapon perfectly. The Japanese crews, realizing they were being hunted by a machine that could hear them, would freeze in horror. The ocean, once their vast, silent ally, had betrayed them. The floating ears had stripped them of their stealth, and for the submarine crews of the Imperial Navy, the mystery of the strange radio chirps was solved only in the final, fiery seconds before their hulls were crushed. The ocean was no longer theirs. It belonged to the machines that listened. By 1944, the dynamic of the Pacific War had undergone a complete inversion. In the early years, American destroyers were sheepdogs, desperately trying to protect the flock of merchant ships from the wolves. But by 1944, the United States Navy had stopped playing defense. They formed hunter-killer groups, wolf packs of their own, designed to hunt the hunters. At the center of these groups were the baby flat tops, small escort carriers converted from merchant hulls. They were slow and ugly, but they carried squadrons of Avengers and Wildcats, armed with the new Fido torpedoes and Sonobuoys. Flanking them were destroyer escorts, nimble ships packed with the latest electronic detection gear. For the Japanese Submarine Force, the ocean had transformed from a sanctuary into a steel cage. The most terrifying example of this new reality occurred in May 1944. The Japanese Navy, preparing for the decisive battle in the Philippines, established a scout line of 7 submarines north of the Admiralty Islands. It was supposed to be a tripwire, an unbreakable chain of observation. Instead, they ran into the USS Times England asterisk. The USS Times England Times was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton. What followed over the next 12 days is a feat that has never been equaled in the history of naval warfare. It was a rampage. On May 19th, the Times England asterisk sonar operators picked up the sharp ping of Times I-16 asterisk. In the past, a destroyer would have dropped depth charges off the stern, disrupting the water and losing sonar contact. But the Times, England Times, was armed with a terrifying new weapon called the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was a forward-firing mortar system. It launched 24 small bombs in a circular pattern ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a set depth, Hedgehogs only exploded on contact with the submarine's hull. This meant the sonar operators could maintain perfect contact right up until the moment of impact. If you heard an explosion, you knew you had a hit. The Times England Times fired. A few seconds later, a violent underwater detonation shook the hull, debris and oil rose to the surface. *I, 16 times, was gone. But the Times, England Times, was just getting started. 3 days later, they found Times RO 106 asterisk. The hunter-killer tactics were executed with surgical precision. Radar-equipped aircraft forced the sub down, and the Times, England Times, moved in for the kill. Asterisk RO 106 times was obliterated. The next day, asterisk RO 104 asterisk sunk. 2 days later, asterisk RO 116 asterisk sunk. 2 days after that, asterisk RO 108 asterisk sunk. The Japanese high command in Tokyo was baffled. Their submarines were simply vanishing. There were no distress calls, no reports of enemy contact, just silence. The final act of the drama played out on May 31st. The Times England asterisk, now exhausted and low on ammunition, hunted down the last submarine in the line, asterisk RO 105 asterisk. This Japanese captain was a veteran. He maneuvered skillfully, dodging attacks for hours. But he was fighting a losing battle against a coordinated machine. The other destroyers in the group, the USS Times George Times and USS Times Raby asterisk, herded the submarine like sheepdogs, keeping it contained until the Times England Times could move in for the killing blow. In just 12 days, a single American destroyer escort had sunk 6 Japanese submarines. An entire scout line had been wiped off the map. This was the terror of the hunter-killer groups. It wasn't just about sinking ships. It was about the total denial of the ocean. The Japanese crews realized that there was literally no place to hide. If they surfaced, radar found them. If they dove, sonobuoys heard them. If they sat still, hedgehogs crushed them. The psychological weight was crushing. The vast Pacific, once their playground, had become a technologically monitored killing jar, and the lid had been screwed tight. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's Submarine Force, once the most feared underwater fleet in the world, had been reduced to a shadow. The ocean, which they had claimed as their own in 1941, was now a graveyard. The technological noose tightened by American radar, Sonobuoys, and Fido torpedoes had strangled the life out of the I-boat fleet. The desperation of the final months was palpable. The skilled captains, the veterans who had terrorized the West Coast and sunk aircraft carriers, were dead. They were lying at the bottom of the Pacific, victims of the relentless hunter-killer groups. In their place sat young, terrified crews who received barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. With conventional tactics failing, Japan turned to the ultimate weapon of despair, the Times Kaiten asterisk. The Times Kaiten Times was a human-guided torpedo. It was a suicide weapon, a metal coffin bolted to the deck of a submarine. The pilot, often a boy barely out of his teens, would climb inside, locked in from the outside, with orders to ram his explosive-filled vessel into an American ship. It was the underwater equivalent of the kamikaze. But even this grim sacrifice failed. The American electronic dragnet was so tight that Japanese submarines were often detected and sunk before they could even launch their suicide weapons. The Times, Kaiten Times pilots died not in a blaze of glory against an enemy hull, but drowned in the crushing dark as their mother submarines were ripped apart by American hedgehogs. The ports of Japan, Kure, Yokosuka, Sasebo, were no longer safe havens. American B-29 bombers had dropped thousands of acoustic mines into the harbor mouths. The submarines were trapped in their own homes. Those that tried to leave were listening to the terrifying sound of their own hulls brushing against trigger wires. When Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender in August 1945, the scale of the devastation became clear. The Imperial Navy had started the war with a diverse, powerful fleet. They ended it with almost nothing. Over 120 Japanese submarines had been sunk. The loss of life was staggering. The submarine force had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the Japanese military. The final irony came with the surrender of the Times I-400 Times class submarines, the Times Sentoku asterisk. These were the monsters of the deep, underwater aircraft carriers that were larger than anything the Americans had ever built. They were technological marvels, designed to launch airstrikes on the Panama Canal. But when they surfaced to surrender, flying black flags from their periscopes, they were pristine. They had never fired a shot in anger. They were dinosaurs, rendered extinct by the evolution of warfare. When American officers boarded these surrendered vessels, they found the equipment intact, but the spirit broken. They realized that mechanical engineering didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter how big your gun was or how fast your torpedo could swim. The Americans had won the war not with steel, but with electrons. They had turned the ocean transparent with sound and radio waves. As the surviving Japanese submarines were towed out to deep water and scuttled by the US Navy in Operation Road's End, sinking beneath the waves for the last time, they left behind a silent, empty ocean. The era of the undetected killer was over. The waters were no longer dark. They were listening.